one of the issues that has been preoccupying me in recent years has been, both as a theorist and scholar and as a practitioner, has been the question of machine agency. Of course, I've been obsessed with this idea of exploring interactions between technology and live performance for a very long time. But recently, I've gotten particularly interested in the concept of the robot as an autonomous agent. The robot who becomes human as its maker is a trope that recurs throughout the history of science fiction, of course, starting, as we all know all too well, with the robots in Karel Čapek's RUR, which famously introduced the term of robot to the world in 1920. In recent years, and with accelerating pace over the past decade, a growing number of theatrical productions and live performance events have incorporated real robots. And such performances invite us to ask at what point a human-crafted mechanical prop acquires its own agency, Pygmalion style, and becomes a performer of its own right. So today, I'm going to use this question to structure a brief overview of the way robots are deployed in theatrical performance, and I'll be drawing both on the recent history of robotic performance, and in some cases not so recent, going back to the 70s, but mostly more recent, in addition on my own experiments and performance with robotics in the classroom using my dear friend Zeebzob, who some of you have had the opportunity to meet in my office, and if you haven't, stop by and say hi. Zeebzob is a Darwin OP robot, and you'll be seeing and hearing from him or her, depending on what character he or she is playing, in a moment. The Darwin OP is an open source robot that was developed through a consortium of universities and then sold commercially by the Korean robot company Robotics. But the model, the designs and the code is all available online if you wanted to build your very own Zeebzob. So I acquired Zeebzob about 5 years ago from a colleague who has since retired in the School of Engineering, and have a lot of fun with him. And in order to pursue this investigation, I worked with a graduate student who works with me in through Ideas for Creative Exploration, a music composition student, who developed a bridge between the software built into Zeebzob. Zeebzob is a computer, has running Linux, and the programming environment that I use, which is Max MSP Jitter. And then I created in Max a tool to allow my students, who tend not to be computer students, but acting students and playwrights and performers, to animate the robot without needing to get into programming. And also to basically use Zeebzob as another output device for Max. So it can be integrated fully with any audio, sound, video, anything. I will be bringing out Zeeb when appropriate to illustrate some of the concepts that I've been looking at. All right, so my talk is going to be focusing on, not wanting to see this, all right? 5 different modes of robotic control which create a continuum from human-centered agency to robot-centered agency. So we'll be progressing through these. And there is, from a theatrical and artistic standpoint, there's absolutely no hierarchy implied. But from a theoretical standpoint, this quest towards the Pygmalion-like autonomous robot is exemplified through this progression. So the first of these concepts is puppeted robotic performance, which is by far the most common way that robots are controlled right now in performance. When a live operator controls the robot's actions in real time within a theatrical context, it enters into precisely the same relationship with this operator that a puppet does with its puppeteer. All right? But unlike conventional robots, the magic of technology makes it possible for the robotic puppet to be untethered physically from the human puppeting it. In addition, designers have extraordinary freedom to design interfaces that manipulate these robotic puppets. So somebody can control a puppet with a joystick, tablet interface, or mimic conventional puppet control such as handheld puppets or marionettes. The options are limited entirely by the creator's imagination. So as I said, a lot of the vast majority of robots used on stage so far have been puppeted. So for example, in 1909, there was a production of A Midsummer's Night Dream at Texas A&M University with 7 remote-controlled drones, 1 pizza-sized air robot, and 6 fist-sized E-flight mini helicopters who were cast as the fairies. One of the most critically successful examples of robotic theater, with which I'm sure many of you are familiar, at least indirectly, because it got a fair amount of press at the time, was Elizabeth Meriwether's Heditron, which was written specifically for puppeted robots and human actors. And this play was first produced a little over 10 years ago in 2006 by the Les Frères Corbusier Theater Company in New York, using robots created by Meredith Chang and Cindy Jeffers of the arts robot collective Botmatrix. And so we see that image to the left. And the show was restaged in 2011 by the Sideshow Theater Company in Chicago, using robots designed by David Hyman, Lizzie Stoessel, and Bruce Phillips, and constructed by members of the Chicago Area Robotics Group. And there it is on the right. Both the Chicago and New York productions assigned a separate operator to control each of the 5 robots. So there was a human actor for each robot. And in both cases, the design, as you can see, exaggerate the robot's mechanical nature for comic effect, with the Frères Corbusier production embracing a low-budget makerspace aesthetic, and the Sideshow production a slightly slicker steampunk aesthetic. During one of the curtain calls, the Sideshow performers exploited and highlighted the real-time control of the robots when the cast invited the lead actress's boyfriend on stage so that the robots could wish him a happy birthday. And the boyfriend turned the tables on her by having the robots assist him in making a surprise marriage proposal. And this is actually, or at least was, available on YouTube for everybody to see. One of the most complex and by far most expensive robotic puppets to date is the 20-foot tall, whoops, there it is. This is the, I'll show you. I'll show you a little bit of this so you can see. This is the marriage proposal. So there are the robots. All right. So, as I was saying, one of the most commercially, probably by far the most commercially successful and expensive robotic puppets to date is a 20-foot tall gorilla created in 2013 by the animatronic company Creature Technology for a musical adaptation of King Kong at the Regent Theatre in Melbourne. Actually, I misspoke, this wasn't especially commercially, it didn't do super well commercially. Their previous Walking with Dinosaurs was phenomenally commercial, but it was definitely the largest and most expensive of these companies' productions. And Elizabeth Joachim has written at length about this company and their use of robots. Sonny Tilders, Creative Technologies creative director, led the design and construction process, and Pete Wilson, the production's puppetry director, coordinated a team of 14 puppeteers. Kong is a hybrid of a puppeted robot and a gigantic, manually operated marionette. His facial expressions are animatronic. 2 ostrich puppeteers use real-time voodoo controls, which the production's director Daniel Kramer describes as being like the ultimate Nintendo Wii Pad, to drive servo motors in Kong's eyes, eyebrows, eyelids, nose, lips, jaw, neck, and shoulders. And a 3rd offstage puppeteer remotely navigates Kong along a 4-ton track and trolley system to move him across the stage. And then finally, a team of 11 circus-trained aerialists dressed in black, dubbed the King's Men, pull and swing on a series of counterbalanced cables to manipulate Kong's limbs in full view of the audience. As Kramer puts it, the King's Men are wonderful reminders that much of the magic of puppetry is seeing the puppeteers, the double vision of the creature's life and the human beings creating that illusion. Now, Creature Technology was compelled to supplement the animatronic elements of its King Kong with manual, albeit super-scaled, marionette controls to overcome some of the limitations of current robotic technology. The range of motions produced by servomotors that drive most robots is much more restricted than that of the simplest handheld puppet, rod puppet, or marionette. Moreover, the precise control with which servomotors snap a robot's joints into position produces the same inertia of matter in robots that von Kleist in On the Marionette Theater described as afflicting human performance, and that Kleist contrasts to the natural grace of marionettes swinging freely with the force of gravity, inhibited by consciousness and affectation, as we all are familiar with that essay. And this reminds me actually of when Basil Twist, the brilliant puppeteer, was doing a residency here and talking about why he disliked hand puppets and why he much preferred, well, cloth, he's done brilliant work just with a piece of cloth or with marionettes. It's a very Kleistian kind of argument. So, and everybody's clear on the way, servos work. So you actually send them a digital number and they snap into exactly that degree of rotation. So you have this incredible precision, which is completely free from the forces of gravity and nature. Examples such as Creature Technology's King Kong, where multiple operators simultaneously control different parts of a single puppet or robot, function, as I'm sure it occurred to many of you, much like Bunraku puppetry. The multiple operators work collectively as performers to create a single performance. We should recall, moreover, that this kind of collaborative performance isn't unique to either robotics or puppetry more generally. For example, we all recall the Open Theater's production in '68 of The Serpent, where you have all these different actors creating the serpent, and many other Open Theater style exercises that did the same thing. All right, so this is robotic puppetry. I'll show you just a couple of images of Creature Technology's work to see that.
You're a puppet maker. They think little puppets, and then you say, well, actually, I've got this little shed that's 3,000 square meters with 40 full-time staff, and we make puppets the size of your house. And then it sort of starts to put in perspective.
This is Sonny's little shed in West Melbourne.
That is impressive.
The world headquarters of global creatures.
This is the neck of the puppet. Got the body on my right hand here, which does the up and down and the twist.
It was the 80s when Sonny got his start on some...
Right, so the Walking with Dinosaurs was a huge commercial, a gargantuan commercial success, and that is 100% puppeted. You can see this totally fun toy. And I'll show you a little bit of King Kong.
His shoulders and his wrists to give him a hyper-realistic illusion of being real.
There is a lot riding on the...
All right. Okay. So the second mode that I'd like to talk about, I call reanimated performance. All right. So while manual puppeteers manipulate their robots in real time, robot puppeteers have the option of recording messages they send to the robot to replay later. The digital instructions that the robot receives and executes will be identical regardless of whether it receives them in real time or after a delay, or whether it's receiving them for the first or 100th time. In other words, if I'm a robot and I get a number that says move my elbow to position 20, I don't know or care whether that number was actually generated by a person in real time or was coming from a file and played back. It's exactly identical to me, right? The situation is similar to that of a video or audio recording of a live performance, but with a crucial ontological difference. When we watch a performance on video, the performer's body is absent. Only an image is present to us. And a video image is a radically different kind of thing, possibly, if you don't believe Philosopher. No, even he acknowledges the ontology, the phenomenology is what he questions, than a human body. By contrast, every time we send a previously recorded instruction to a robot, a real robot performs the actions. So not just from the robot's perspective, but from our perspective, we are seeing a robot move in exactly the same way. We're not seeing an image of a robot. We're seeing the robot. It's exactly the same thing. So there's no ontological distinction between a robot that responds to real-time messages and one that responds to stored messages. Moreover, when a robot executes robot puppeteer's recorded commands, And this is, I think, for me, the most significant thing. It retains its indexical link to that puppeteer. So when you see a puppet being controlled, a puppeted robot or puppet, part of what gives it that vitality is it's an extension of a human being. It's a performance. It's a live performance. And if it's deferred, it's still a live performance. It's exactly the same performance. We see that indexical link to the puppeteer who was sending those messages, who was creating that control, but just after a period of time, just the delay. So we don't merely see a reproduction or representation of the puppeteer's performance, but a reanimation of that performance. The robot puppeteer is performing across time. The situation here is a lot like a player piano, where we've got Gershwin playing on a piano roll, and then it's reanimated. We hear that piano roll again. One method for creating time-delayed performance, robotic performance, is to record a robot's motions while an operator manually moves the robot's parts, rather than driving the robot by remote control. And this is actually the way that Darwin Animator, the software that I developed, works. So the way the robots are typically manipulated, and the way that Darwin sort of out of the box is manipulated, is by entering a series of numbers that represent each of the points of the robot, and then going like keyframe animation from frame to frame. So this, then that, and the robot interpolates the motions to go to those different positions, and the programmer then creates a motion out of that. So instead of that, what I did is, actually there is that ability in robot animation. You can create poses and go from pose to pose, and there are a few cases where that's useful, but very, very, very few. You also have real-time control, so you can move ZeebZop's head in real time or have him walk around, and we certainly do that a fair amount in performance. But the central way of animating is actually to turn off the servos so that they're completely limp, and then a person can move them, and so then you're using the forces of gravity and the completely variable and erratic and quirky qualities of motion, with every part of your body moving at a different speed and in a different way, and then recording that. So it is puppeted. The cool thing about that, though, is you're puppeting it by actually moving it around, and then you disappear, and then it plays it back, right? So it's doing something that a robot couldn't do, right? It's not simply creating a manual puppet with unnecessary technology. And in particular, the way that it works actually is you can select which of the servos you want to control. So there's an image of the robot. You can click on any of the joints, and that goes limp, and you move that one, and you can layer them. So typically, the way that we animate ZeebZob is the arms first, and then often I start with the voice, and then that can be put into the recording, and then you add all the different elements. And you can erase the arms and then redo the arms without redoing the legs to build it that way. But the video that I'm going to show you, just for the sake of clarity, something we virtually never do for performance, but we're animating. I have two people, one is me and one is one of my students, animating ZeebZob all at once. So so you're going to see us recording the motion, and then you'll see it played back. There we are. So programming this kind of motion would take forever. Recording it's real time. Take forever and probably not get the quality of expressivity that you can get this way. All right, so that's recorded, and then it plays back.
Hi guys, good to see ya. I mean, not that I can't see you, but I wish I could. I wish I could be there as part of your institute, but I wasn't accepted. Anyway, have fun.
Not a university professor, what can I say? All right. Sergio had already heard about this at the time when it happened. The first full production that we created with ZeebZob, which is also, I may talk briefly about this in terms of the pedagogy tomorrow too, because it's my favorite mode of pedagogy, which is actually working together on an actual project. So we've got this robot, I create this tool, a little bit like Isadora, but a much smaller scale, sort of develop the tool with the students to see what they need, and so it keeps evolving throughout the class. And so we create a goal, which is to create this performance for the public at the end of the semester. So we have no computer people in this class at all. Nobody's ever worked with a robot. We've got actors, we've got playwrights, we've got costume designer, set designer, We all worked together. Actually, one of my colleagues who specializes in commedia dell'arte created the masks and helped us with some of the lazzi. And so we created from scratch this performance. We went with commedia precisely because what I was interested in with playing around with Zebzab was the creation of character, which is something that roboticists tend not to think about, this sort of this generic thing. So teaching Zebzab to embody as many different types of tact, to embody really different types of characters. And of course, commedia is a very physical form with its strong gestures, which are impossible for the robot to actually really replicate, but it's a good challenge. And then the masks were fun. So, and it's got these really short scenes, which practically was terrific because Zebzab gets messages in real time through Darwin Animator over the internet. So it can either be through Ethernet cable, and it can be plugged in, or it can be wireless and it can run off a battery. But the batteries only have about 10 minutes at most battery life. So these short scenes worked really well. So Zebzab could come on, do a little shtick, then go off stage. People rapidly change the battery while something happened in front of the shtick. Worked out great. And then come back on as a completely different character with a different mask. So I'm going to show you a very short excerpt of Commedia Robotica. It's actually the whole thing. It was a half-hour performance. It wasn't very long. This is a 4-minute Reader's Digest version of it. So it starts out in the Cellar Theater downstairs, which you saw very, very briefly when I gave you that tour at the very beginning. And you've got the programmer who, amusingly enough, was one of our dramatic media students. He actually did most of the animations and provided the voice of Zebzab. So, and he's really sitting there with Darwin Animator, for the most part just hitting Q, 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 but also every once in a while puppeting him. So he plays the programmer and he is the programmer. And the idea is he is this programmer who has created this Commedia robot and put out an ad for a live person to perform with the robot. So, and so this actress comes in, and of course, being a professional Commedia actress, she knows all this, she could come in and improvise right away as soon as she knows the scenario. She's not worried that she hasn't rehearsed. The audience is there. She comes in for the performance and finds this robot. He'd forgotten completely to mention that her partner was going to be a robot. And initially, she's sort of resistant to this idea, but warms up to it until by the end of the half hour, she's fallen in love with Zebzab, and fortunately, the feelings are mutual, and they run off together. All right, so we'll see a little bit of this.
This is Zebzab.
A robot?
Yeah, exactly. The first robotic Commedia dell'arte performer.
Okay, you've got to be kidding. Right, I'm not going to do a puppet show, so...
He's a robot.
Robot, right, whatever. I'm sorry, I didn't sign up for this. I'm a professional actor. I work with other professional human actors. I don't want help with your science project. I'm so sorry.
Please don't go.
Who said that? Okay, so you programmed the robot to do...
He tried.
Okay, I guess we'll see about that.
So you'll do it?
Well, no, I didn't say that.
Well, I was going to just ask the audience to know that.
She looks so sad. You are really cute. I don't know, since I'm here, I guess, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, I'll give you some money, so.
I'll give you my husband and be right back. Stay up there, okay?
Okay, I mean. Okay, is this gonna work out?
Come on, let's send him on his way.
Alright, and only because it's really cute.
Yeah.
Okay, let's just,
All right. One.
is Pantalone counting his money? That's perfect!
Your eyes, so stunning, and it's zero.
Oh.
They remind me of the strength of the ocean. The same ocean I destroyed 500 Cylon troopers, obliterated 20,000 Terminators, and shut down Death Star. I drew upon every ounce of strength I had in my motors, the same strength and passion that burns in your eyes. It must be for me.
I love you so much.
I love you too!
Without you, I am metal and zero and everything else. But with you, I feel it. I am alive.
Oh,
He gets jealous and he unplugs the robot.
Sorry. I'm sorry. No, I didn't program any of that. It's obviously malfunctioning.
Oh, so it's a malfunction to love me?
You can't love.
Just make him come back.
I was just saying something you wasn't into. These total scrap metal.
Metal. So what, you just reset it?
Well, yeah.
Will you remember me?
Well, no.
Page.
Zeke? Zeke? Zeke, can you hear me?
Take me with you.
Okay, I'm there.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye, everyone.
You're all invited to the wedding. Expect an Evite.
Okay. So, for most of the show, the programmer, whenever Zeeb is on stage, is sitting in front of the computer. At that moment, he's not. So we had to find a way to cue the robot, because Darwin Animator has sort of the cues on it. So we programmed the foot at that point. So that's why she was actually doing the thing with the foot to go on to advance to the next cue. All right. So that's reanimated performance. The third mode of performance is what I call algorithmic performance, or animatronic performance. So in this case, rather than having that indexical link either in real time or through delayed performance, you've got, as I said, this is a very, very common way of programming the robot. It's usually it's either real-time robotic puppet control or this sequencing of events. And so, as I said, one way to do it is this cue to cue. Another is in a purely algorithmic kind of style. So this is an example. This is actually Max MSP, but not using Darwin. Well, it's using a little bit of Darwin. It's sending the commands directly to the robot, but bypassing the whole puppetry interface and creating a straight algorithm. So what it's doing is it's simply counting from 0 to 100 and then back again. And as it does that, it's panning the head and the shoulder and these other, a certain amount of number of degrees. So it's a pure algorithmic program. So I programmed this not knowing what it would look like exactly. And then hit the button and you play with it and you get something that you sort of like. And so this is what it looks like. Totally different style of motion. Again, not better, not worse. In some ways it's very beautiful. And you could use this then to animate a live performance, right? You could have somebody that imitate the robot's motion, but it's the robot's natural vocabulary. It's a pure computer-generated performance. Okay. Let's see. So when you have a purely algorithmic performance or an animated performance that has no cues, it goes in sequence, then you create, and this is one of the problems the reanimated performances as well, a huge difference between real-time puppetry and the reanimated performance. I've been emphasizing the similarities, but there is a very big difference, not in the robot itself, it doesn't know the difference, but in the robot's ability to interact with the live performers. It's, the live performer is in a different time than the puppeteer. And that's going to be an issue with the sort of animatronic algorithmic performances I'm talking about as well that have no sensory input, but are simply, you turn them on and they do their thing. The play Sayonara, which actually Peter talked a little bit about at the beginning of the week, produced in 2010 by the Sanden Theater Company and Osaka University Robot Theater Project, features the Geminoid F, the hyper-realistic robot, created, as you heard, by Ishiguro, one of the world's leading robotic scientists, whose obsession is to create these incredibly, uncannily lifelike creatures, but he denies the existence of the uncanny valley effect altogether. And when the play was initially performed in Japan, an offstage human operator controlled the Geminoid F's movement in real time, speaking the robot's dialogue into a microphone while cameras tracked her facial expressions and head movements. And actually the body doesn't move at all in the performance. And this is the way that Ishiguro would actually animate most of his robots at that time. When the production toured the United States 3 years later, which is when I saw it, the robot's motions were then entirely canned. The robot's performance was then encoded with no internal cueing or interactivity during the 30-minute performance. It was turned on in the beginning, play to the end. And I'm going to show you a little bit of that performance. They said the hands don't move at all.
他の詩を読んで。はい。我、地上の川より川を下りしが、船引きの綱のいざない。いつか覚えず、罵り騒ぐ万人は、水夫を的にとひっ捕らえる。
All right, because you have a feel for it. So in a talkback discussion following the performance that I saw in Philadelphia, the production's director, Hirata, explained that the robot is totally controlled by myself, just like the human performers. I'm not interested in improvisation, either for robots or humans. And Beverly Long, the live actor who performed alongside the Geminoid F, I actually asked the question, so what was it like to have, because I've actually written about, inveighing against canned performances of media and forcing the actor to conform to this relentless media onslaught. So I asked, was this a challenge? And she explained that because Hirata always dictates actors' timing precisely, her process working with the robot wasn't significantly different than it had been when she worked with live actors on previous productions of the director. Animatronic theme parks typically use extended pre-recorded robotic sequences, but in theatrical productions with robots, the more common approach is to break the robot's motions into short segments that an operator runs as a series of cues during the performance. The technique used, for example, in Commedia Robotica, we had a number, some of the motion as it was puppeted, mainly the robot's head so that the robot could track the live actor in real time, and the walking was all in real time too, so that it wouldn't walk off the stage in part. But the more complex motions were all pre-recorded. So as a combination, the cues would go from, make this robotic control to puppet control to the animated sequence. You could also combine them. It could walk while you control the head manually, for example. All right. So let's see. So a recent example, I'm going to show you an example of a performance that uses algorithmic control as opposed to the deferred, the reanimated performance. And this is a production called Uncanny Valley. There are two plays, confusingly, called Uncanny Valley that were written recently. One actually I directed, it's a fantastic play, but it's just live people. There's a live person who plays a robot. The other uses a real robot. And this one was conceived and directed by Francesca Talenti in 2014. And the production featured Robo-Thespian, a life-size robot manufactured by Engineering Arts Limited specifically for human interaction in a public environment, like a trade show or a museum exhibit. And so the RoboThespian is programmed in the way that I was talking about with the pose-to-pose actions. And in this play, Dummy, portrayed by RoboThespian, convinces Edwin, portrayed by the human actor Alphonse Nicholson, to sign over his memories and emotions to the robot. And as the play progresses, the robot increasingly assimilates Nicholson's identity. RoboThespian's proprietary software employs standard algorithmic programming methods. The programmer defines a series of poses and links them together using the programming language, in this case, Python. Okay. The production, however, complicated the issues of robotic agency in a way that dovetailed effectively with the issues raised within the play itself. The robot's physical motions were created but not performed by the production's programmers. The dummy's face, however, was a video image of Nicholson projected onto the translucent white surface of RoboThespian's head. And the voice was also recorded by Nicholson. All right, so this is pre-recorded. The actual live actor's face was on the robot. I'm going to show you just a product demo of RoboThespian so you can get a sense of the quality of it.
It sings.
I'm singing away.
It acts.
Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune.
And it even impersonates other robots.
I beg your pardon, General Solar, but that just wouldn't be proper.
One of the stars of CeBIT 20.
So that's RoboThespian. I don't know if you can tell looking at it the difference in motion between, say, Darwin and this, because it's pretty well animated, but it has a smoothness. There's a sort of roughness and awkwardness, which I think, in a sort of vitality from the animator process that you don't get from the pose-to-pose process. Rachel Carey, in a review of the production, observes that on paper it would be easy to dismiss RoboThespian as a mere puppet. A mere puppet. After all, a great deal of his facial and vocal nuances are provided by Nicholson, but RoboThespian has his own credit in the program for a reason. He's deeply engaging, a unique performance entity. I'd argue that robots programmed algorithmically are, in essence, not puppets, and not really, strictly speaking, robots, but a form of automaton. And from a performance standpoint, are much like the automata that long predate the computer age, such as the famous trio of still functional automata by Pierre-Jacques Dreux, the writer, the draftsman, and the musician, whose ability to write a variety of texts, draw a variety of images, and play a variety of tunes on the piano, respectively, anticipated the invention of the programmable computer. So this type of automata goes back, has been documented extensively, at least to the 16th century, and actually there's evidence of these going way back to the classical era. Okay. In the same way that programmers script a robot's movements without performing those movements themselves, the inventors who created these pre-electrical automata devised elaborate networks of gears to animate mechanical devices without themselves ever performing those actions. Kenneth Gross, in his 2011 book Puppets, an Essay on Uncanny Life, correctly insists that such automata shouldn't be confused with puppets. He says, it is indeed the absence of actual bodily life that makes the purely mechanical movements of a wind-up doll or automaton, however lifelike, feel so different from the life of puppets. The lack of the living, moving hand in the automatons, the machine's inability to respond in real time, to improvise humanly, or even humanly fall into inaction, these things place it in a different kind of theater. I leave it to you to think about whether you agree with that or not. The difference that Gross intuits here between puppets and automata is, I believe, real and significant, but I'd argue that Gross is conflating two distinct features of automata. First, the motions are defined algorithmically rather than being indexically linked to a real-time human performance in either the past or the present, right? So you don't have that indexical link. Second, the motions are predetermined and invariable. You don't have the interactivity. And those are two very different things. You can have either one without the other. As we've seen when a mechanical performer plays back a human puppeteer's pre-recorded gestures, what Gross describes as the puppeteer's living, moving hand is still evident in the robot's motions. And conversely, it's entirely possible to create robots that respond autonomously to the world around them in real time, producing algorithmic motions with no indexical link to any human performance. And, amazingly enough, that's what we're going to look at next. So I call this mode of interaction a reactive robot. Okay, reactive performance. So I have here ZeebZob reacting to sound just the way we were playing around with Isadora. It's just taking the sound input. ZeebZob has a microphone built into it. He also has a speaker, so he makes his own sounds. And this was a simple program so that ZeebZob, it actually is using Darwin animator, but it's the one time that I use the pose mode. So you can go to a pose proportionally. So it's got a pose for when it hears the noise and a pose when it doesn't. And it goes that depending on how loud the volume is. So it's actually, in Max, literally you program with objects that you connect together a lot like Isadora. This is literally a 2-object program. This is taking sound input and going right into, it's actually scaling it and then going into the pose, right? And that's all there is to it. But it creates a very, very interactive or reactive dynamic kind of experience that is going to be different each and every time somebody interacts with it. So here it is. And I actually built in a little bit of a delay to make it. Okay. All right. So artists have been creating performative works with autonomous robots for decades. Typically, however, this work is developed not for theater venues, but for gallery or museum settings where robots interact with the audience and where you can actually experience that kind of interactivity by playing with it yourself. So first, it's relatively simple to simulate autonomous robotic behavior in a rehearsed performance with actors. And conversely, it's much easier for spectators to assess whether a robot's responses are truly reactive when they interact with it themselves. And second, while robotic puppetry is, given the simplest current state of technology, the simplest and most effective way to give theatrical robots the ability to interact with live actors, real-time puppetry is less practical in an installation context, right? So you can't really have puppeted performance in a museum 24 hours a day. So the museum context, the gallery context has driven this kind of either automata or reactive performance. One of the earliest and most influential reactive performances, if you did the reading from Chris Salter, you'll see it was Edward Inautsowitz's The Senster, commissioned in 1970 by Philips Electronics for the Avalon Science Museum in the Netherlands. So this 15-foot-long hydraulic robot had an abstracted animal-like form with 3 legs, a long neck, loosely evocative of a giant insect or a dinosaur. The creature, controlled by a mainframe computer, used a Doppler radar to track visitors' movements and recoiled from sudden movements and sounds. Okay. Another example, in 1993, Simon Penny created a similarly reactive piece, Petit Mal, with the goal of producing a robotic, this is his words, a robotic artwork which is truly autonomous and that gives the impression of intelligence and has behavior which is neither anthropomorphic nor zoomorphic, but which is unique in its physical and electronic nature. So this was the robot, approximately 3 feet tall, consisting of little more than a vertical rod topped with sensors and flanked by 2 bicycle wheels. It sensed when somebody was nearby and rolled toward that person, continuously turning and moving in an effort to maintain a forward-facing position 2 feet away from the spectator. So super simple algorithm, but like the sound with ZeebZob, depending on how you move, you can create an infinite number of different types of behaviors and responses, giving that sense of reactivity and cognizance to it in a purely independent kind of way. And actually, he appeared with my first robotic, actually not interactive installation, Flico. They were actually, in 1993, they were in the same exhibit. It was kind of fun. The exhibit that, to the extent to which such robots are purely reactive, their behavior is predictable, and most significantly, under the control of the human that interacts with it. So in the case of ZeebZob, in the case of Petit Mal, they actually don't have any ability to modify the algorithm, and so you can then figure out, I move like this, it's going to do this, I move. You can actually choreograph it, dance with it. I can quickly figure out as an audience member that I am actually in control of the robot's movements. And so I'm apt to adopt a perspective outside the fictional frame, at least temporarily, to experiment with my ability to move the manipulator. And you see this all the time. So you break the rules of the game and you start playing with the robot. Even after I become aware that the robot has no real autonomy, however, I still retain the ability to shift my perspective, or shift the frame back, and respond to the robotic character as an autonomous being with its own personality and emotions. Right? So you have a two-way performance, the human performer who knows full well it's not sentient, but can perform with it as sentient, as responsive. The simplest way to endow an inherently reactive system with the illusion of autonomy is to program in some random behaviors. For example, Petit Mal could randomly change the distance. So instead of always being 2 feet, it could just randomly shift between 2 and 5, and in some cases it might want to be 100 feet. So then you think, why does it hate me and it seems to like that person? Just totally randomly. To create richer and less arbitrary behaviors, one can create robots with multiple, sometimes conflicting inputs, or create a feedback system by putting multiple responsive robots together and having them react to each other. And this brings us to our next example. Bill Vaughan and Louis-Philippe Demers implemented precisely these strategies back in the 1990s in a series of robotic installations that, again, Salter talks about, though I don't believe he talks about this one, which is the one that I saw. These robots are completely non-anthropomorphic. They describe the work as a form of theater where robots are the actors, so it's normal that we want to project emotions onto them. So one of their first collaborations was a robotic sculpture called Espace Victoral, which consisted of 8 tall motorized tubes, approximately 4 feet tall, each containing a speaker and a light source. Ultrasonic sensors tracked spectators as they moved around the circumference of the installation, and each tube responded independently to the spectators by rotating and producing sound. Though they didn't communicate directly with one another, they were each completely separate, the tubes seemed to be working together to create structured patterns and behavior until at a particular point one tube would break away from the flock and point directly to an individual spectator. So I'll show you just a little bit of this performance. And it's from 1993. A system of this sort can exhibit seemingly complex behaviors that produce a powerful illusion of sentience, emotion, and personality, even if it's completely non-anthropomorphic. Such systems are unable to pursue and modify long-term goals, develop strategies, or learn and adapt to behaviors over time. Artificial intelligence researchers distinguish between reactive systems like these and deliberative systems, a distinction that parallels the one made by neuroscientists between automatic, reactive, and willed deliberative behaviors. While some AI researchers focus on one or the other of these two approaches, increasingly the trend is to develop hybrid reactive deliberative systems. To date, there have been few efforts to incorporate a high level of deliberative AI into robotic performance. But as the technology matures and becomes more accessible, that's likely to change. Again, I leave totally open the question from an artistic or ethical or whatever standpoint whether it should. I mean, there's no, so that's something for us to think about. Now close to 15 years old, one of the few effective examples, actually I'm going to show you, just here's a behavior. This is not, at least ostensibly, an art behavior. This is the Darwin OP robot, not Zebza, but another one, which has been programmed to kick a ball, right? So it's completely reactive, but it has a goal. It's got an objective. It wants to kick the ball.
So here I will listen to
holding the camera in its head.
This is practice. It will walk towards this ball, and then it will stop. And it will grab the ball, and then throw it away.
Right, it throws the ball.
It will keep doing it. And then
and that reaction is significant. There's something about, well, Zebzob himself is cleverly designed to evoke this sort of cute response, which is adorable. But also seeing that deliberative behavior, it's like seeing a baby doing it. It's like, well, this is doing something, or a pet that's doing it, a cat. But of course, Zebzob is doing absolutely nothing at all. It's a really simple algorithm that's simply programmed to do what it's been programmed to do. So anyway, now close to 15 years old, one of the few effective examples of an autonomous robotic performance that employs this hybrid reactive deliberative approach remains a piece called Public Anemone, way back in 2002. It was a robotic installation at SIGGRAPH, the big computer graphics tech conference, created by Cynthia Brazil, who is one of the long-term innovators in the field of social robotics. She actually literally wrote the book, Social Robotics. It came out of her PhD dissertation back in, I think it was 99 or something. It's been quite a while. Brazil is a Brazil's created a series of robots called Kismet and Leonardo that are designed specifically to simulate human behaviors. So that's her whole focus, is to create a kind of emotional intelligence in these robots. Public Anemone is a much more abstract piece that it's an interactive terrarium filled with imaginary biomorphic creatures that she refers to as anemones. The installation includes a computer vision, this is way back 2002, a computer vision system capable of isolating and analyzing multiple features on multiple individuals in real time and conveying that information to these little creatures. And each anemone is programmed to carry out specific tasks, such as bathing in a waterfall or watering plants. So the idea is that it's engaging in its behaviors on its own. And then as you get closer, an anemone might become distracted from its task and approach with interest. If a spectator makes a threatening gesture, the anemone might retreat fearfully before gradually regaining its composure and either returning to its task or tentatively reaching out to another spectator. Brazil undertook this project because she regards theater as the perfect test bed for social robotic research. To quote, "Good actors often say that half of acting is reacting. Hence, a robotic actor must be able to react in a convincing and compelling manner to the performance of another entity, whether human or robot. This requires sophisticated perceptual, behavioral, and expressive capabilities. Introducing improvisation or allowing for more audience participation makes the situation that much more unpredictable and unconstrained. Approaching open-ended interaction with people. Advances within such a test scenario could help bootstrap the social interactivity of robots in the real world." So in performances with human actors, the sort of performances with which audiences are most familiar, the performer and the embodied character are both typically housed in the same body. That is a live actor. In the case of puppets, however, whether robotically or manually controlled, the performer and the embodied character part company. Right? Simple enough. The puppeteer performs through the robot. So the performer is me, the embodied character is this other thing. By contrast, in the case of algorithmically performed robots, the programmer animator does not perform through the robot in that way, right? But creates the robot's performance. So I create the performance, but I've never performed it. In the case of autonomous robots, the programmers, which at this point I still think would say is a hypothetical thing, the programmers and engineers neither perform through the robot, nor do they actually create the robot's performance, but rather they create a robotic performer. So we've come full circle. Like a live actor, the performer and the embodied actor once again become one and the same, though now they're both situated in the body of the robot rather than the human performer. So robot performers destabilize the notion of performance, and in particular the agency of the performer. The robot's agency is distributed in complex, ambiguous, and often, even within a given performance, fluid ways among its robotic designers, programmers, and operators, even as it begins to acquire, without at this stage in the technology self-awareness or indeed any degree of sentience, its own autonomous agency. Moreover, within the context of a theatrical performance, its behaviors and choices are also defined and circumscribed by the agency of a playwright and/or a director. The questions who is acting and who is pulling the strings become terribly fraught. However, as we examine these dynamics closely, we see that they're different in degree, but not really in kind from those of more conventional performance with human performers. As those involved in the making of performances in theater and film are well aware, the construction of an actor's performance is always a deeply collaborative process, with multiple forces animating and ornamenting the body of the performer. So I'll end by returning to the figure of Pygmalion that I started with, this time as envisioned in L. Hirschfeld's famous illustration for the original Broadway production of My Fair Lady, which is in my office. It depicts the image of Henry Higgins pulling Eliza Doolittle's strings as if she were a marionette, while in turn George Bernard Shaw, figured as God, pulls on Higgins' strings. This image vividly reminds us that the complex layers of agency in puppetry, and even more so in robotics, are already implicit in the dynamics of all theater and performance. All right, thank you very much. So we have some time for your thoughts and comments? Yeah. Sheldon.
This is sort of an anecdote, and maybe it's a question. In the news lately, in the Bay Area, I've seen them in Berkeley and now in San Francisco, there's delivery robotic drones that just sort of wheel down the sidewalk and deliver food to people. And so the news hasn't been about, how great that is. It's mostly been about how people have taken to kicking them, urinating on them, in one case setting one on fire. And so, as these things become real and start to really actually become a part of our lives, there's obviously tensions about this.
Absolutely.
We have real feelings about this. And so I'm just curious, as you put these things on stage, what your experience has been with audiences trying to negotiate these tensions between,
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic point. And it's really interesting to try to think through those different reactions. What I found, the response, as I mentioned before, to Zebzab tends to be, that people fall in love with Zebzab. Zebzab is very cute. I wish I had that charisma that Zebzab seems to naturally have. Within the safe environment of the theater. But there was another sort of installation event that I can't remember who created it, that I read about, of this robot that was supposed to make this long trek across the country and did not make it very far. Anybody familiar with that? It was people kept abusing the poor robot and strike. It was supposed to ask for help, and it was ultimately did not make it far. How much of that has to do with, in a museum or an installation, people always try to break the thing to test it and to see how it works. But I think within a communal setting of the theater, I think people's responses would be very different than in the sort of wonder if you see it wandering through the street. But it's a really fascinating question. With those, it's a question of affect. It gets back to that, when it triggers that response. Yeah.
This is just sort of a follow-on to that. But I think this is sort of really fascinating to think about the ways that the robot as puppet is connected to the actor's role in the theatre. But one of the big differences is that humans have subjectivity outside of that context.
Right.
So it's sort of, again, it comes back to that sense of the frame. And inside of that frame, there are rule-based interactions that can sort of create autonomy. And one of the questions that sort of, this is more like about the whole areas, the whole kind of range of things that we've been talking about and studying is, I think a lot of these moves are sort of moving towards a universal language of total translatability, in the sense of the way that the computer programs we've been looking at work, and, so that one so that a sound can drive a machine or a light can trigger, you know, that this kind of, the language of zeros and ones can turn a thing into another thing almost completely.
Right.
You know, and
absolutely.
I think that's maybe part of what people are struggling with robots, is the sort of breakdown of ontology, you know. And I wonder for us, as we're thinking about the digital humanities and things that we make and things that we do, also about the translatability of one face onto another or one voice onto another, and whether this kind of border panic that we're experiencing in so many ways in our world is also to do with this kind of breakdown of these ontological distinctions between types of things, types of beings and types of processes.
Right. I think
so that's a sort of really big thought or question, but I, you know, without really a focus, but I feel like there's a sort of underlying common theme in so many of the things that are going on in different parts of our world to do with this ontological breakdown that is also a source of such incredible power. But one thing can translate into another. You know, like the fact that your project was called Rosetta seems very significant to me in all these directions.
Yeah, absolutely. And specifically in the case of robots and the issues I'm looking at, you're dealing with, goes right back to the initial, you know, Maury's theory of the uncanny, that border between life and not life, and the terror of seeing that. And precisely by complicating that, it's a very, very, very threatening thing. And as you were talking, you know, something struck me, you're talking about the use of this in digital humanities. Humanities, it's built right in there, digital humanities, right? And, you know, I think the threat of the drones walking, you know, delivering groceries or whatever, you know, part of that is an economic threat, are these robots. And every time people, from the very beginning when people talk about robots in a theater, oh, they're going to take away jobs from actors? I mean, that's the joke that everybody always likes to make first. There is this threat, are we losing something about our own humanity by challenging it in that way? Or by, you know, so it might be that the straightforward robotic puppets don't threaten you in that way, because they're still tethered to a human, or at least even if it's deferred. But the autonomous robots out in the street delivering groceries are going to be, I think, a lot scarier and more threatening. And it might be in, you know, the robotic installation, you know, that is purely reactive and completely non-anthropomorphic. The reaction to that is not how cute. And the music actually that was created for that was not adorable music. It was creepy, threatening, you know, fascinating, enthralling. But it questions you, are these alive? Are they not alive? What does it mean? It is responding, but they're not sentient, but how do I really know? And what does that even mean? You know.
Well, I was just thinking about this alongside sort of the newest generation of Disney's animatronic figures, which use sort of the traditional animatronic frame, but they're now going to all electric to make them smoother in terms of their movement. But within the face, they've gone to a completely projected mapping technology. So what they're doing is making, in essence, not that they ever wanted those animatronics to look particularly human, but they're now able to make those animatronic figures look like almost literal 3D versions of the animated films, some of which are 3D. So I kind of wonder how that project, which is admittedly a hugely sort of commercial one in which you want little kids to be able to see the thing in front of you, right? How that sort of interacts within this sort of, I don't know, the spectrum, the sort of the range of the examples that you were giving here, or in light of this sort of, these are ones that we were supposed to love as opposed to want to kick.
Right. Well, the decisive issue in terms of what I was talking about has to do with the degree of interactivity or autonomy. So insofar as you turn it on and it does its thing, whether the face is projected or, you know, it doesn't make a difference there.
Sure.
It certainly can make a huge difference in your affect, in your affective response to it, for sure. But you know, I've seen in the Harry Potter world, in the bank, the animatronic figures there are incredible, and their facial expressions are just wonderful. They're beautiful. They're amazing. They've gotten really advanced, but they're 100% canned.
Right.
And you know, I think that our response to those, and they're just like, how fun, this is really cool, but I think when they actually can look right at you and respond to you, people are going to start feeling, we'll see, but my prediction would be I would feel more threatened and creeped out.
And they did have, for a little while, a thing called the Living Character Initiative, which were more about sort of these kinds of animatronic characters that would roam the park and have direct interaction.
Right.
And also using their Bluetooth technology to be able to like know the kids' names. This was sort of a
Right.
thing too, which was also kind of freaky if suddenly this character knows your child and what that means in terms of stranger danger and those kinds of things. So I think that you're exactly right. That I think that that they've even sort of had to sort of go back to the drawing board in terms of that, the interactivity and how much interactivity may be too much with the sort of the more realistic versions of these characters.
And some of it actually in the when I directed Uncanny Valley, which the other Gibbons Uncanny Valley, which doesn't have a robot in it, I did let Zeeb Zob, because he was really giving me a hard time about doing a robot show without him, do the curtain speech. But at the beginning, as the audience came in, he was just standing there like a prop and sort of, you know, looking around like that. And every once in a while, he would zoom in on a person, and his eye color would change and track that person around. Because he was being controlled remotely, and the camera was transmitting back to the computer backstage, so the person could see it. But that was a freaky moment, because it's that changing frame moment where you think you're just seeing this prop, and then suddenly it seems sentient, and it responds to you. That was kind of fun. And then it did its cam speech.
Yeah, I just want to add that I'm always fascinated by, we like want to make ourselves. We want to build ourselves, but then when we get too close, we kind of want to stop.
Yeah.
Like, wait a minute, right? So there's just this weird, because I was thinking this yesterday, as I always do in workshops, like, why is it so exciting when we can go like this and make magic happen over there? You know, there's this like extension of our will, which is kind of magic. So we like want to create magic, and we want to, it's that. I mean, it is that. We want to be the guy at the top right there, making the next one. But when we achieve it, we kind of go, whoa, hang on. Maybe I don't want that. Because in the case that Sheldon just brought up, that did take a job.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Somebody lost their job because they don't need the delivery boy anymore. You know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't have a question. It's just
Yeah.
a phenomenon that's yeah.
And then there's sex robots. I mean,
oh yeah.
The implications of that are so enormous
Right.
in terms of instrumentalization and the future of women.
Yes.
And
yes.
Well, I was thinking of when you were talking about agency in particular, right? That might be in terms of sex robots. Actually, like this is now like the sort of opened up frontier, right? So I think it was just at the CES they introduced a sex robot that detects overly aggressive behavior, or if the robot feels like it's being treated inappropriately, will shut down and become unresponsive. And this was apparently programmed, I can't remember the name of the roboticist who did it, but into the objections of his wife. Right, and so now.
Wait, what did you say? The wife objected to his programming that?
Yes, no, his wife objected to the sort of lack of consent that sex robots were engendering and facilitating.
Yeah.
And so he introduced a new feature. I think it's Samantha. Is that the Samantha sex robot?
Yeah.
I might be misremembering this.
Yeah, I was just reading about this and pulling the article back up. I was just reading about this the other day. What's creepy about that feature is that it stops the interactivity of the robot, but in no way prevents continued.
No, that's
right.
So
I mean,
you could still just.
It actually doesn't. It actually. I mean, I guess in that it just transforms an encounter from one that is consensual into non-consensual.
Yes, and it's, considering that the consumer is the person who's going to be interacting with the robot, then unless it was legally mandated or something, that certainly wouldn't be a feature.
That brings in the whole ethics of, when you get into that of artificial intelligence, the ethics, that whole argument that now we have to start talking about. Because at the end of the day, it's wires and binary.
For sure. Yeah, that robot doesn't feel anything.
Right.
Exactly.
It had some sensing programmed into it.
Right, so the ethics there don't really have to do, obviously, with the robot. We're not concerned about
it's
the
all
robot,
about
we're concerned about what the
how we
person's
play.
being trained to do. So it gets into the same debates with video games and violence.
Exactly.
Although there is also then a further edge when we start talking about bioart.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And so if you look at Oren and oh gosh, what is it? Oren Katz and who's the other of ours
Right. That.
Come back to me. I have Googling I must do. Hang on.
Eduardo Cox and the Not at this point. Who did the rabbit?
That was at Robotic.
Yeah.
No, I'm thinking of Symbiotica. So Oren Katz and I can't remember his collaborator, which I really should remember. Anyway, Symbiotica in Australia had developed a project. I think they called it like the living jacket. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Basically, they started doing experiments with so-called victimless meat, right? Synthetically created organic flesh, and they built a little tiny quote-unquote living leather jacket, which was constructed out of this synthetic meat, and so it lives in this kind of bathed solution, and it is organic material, and it is growing, right? It is cells reproducing. And they installed it. I believe it was at MoMA, and it like lived in a little tank. And it gets a little weird because it's growing, and and then they left. Ionit Zur, I think, is his partner. Anyway, they left it, and then at the end of the exhibition, the curator calls them up and is like, "So what do I do with it?" And they're like, "Well, you've got to turn it on," and which essentially means killing it. Right, so you've got an artificially created biological system that is consuming, that is reproducing, that is growing, right? That is an organic, quote unquote, living entity, artificially supported. Kind of really interesting intersection of bioart and robotic art. That in order to deinstall the installation, like you've got to basically pull the plug on something that's alive, and that's not alive in the way a plant is alive, right? There's like, it's alive in the way that flesh is alive, right? So you turn it on. Anyway, so it raised some of the same kind of questions and freaked out the curator quite a bit. Yeah. Had not anticipated that particular moment.
One question I could throw out that's interesting, just in terms of the threat that people have of robotics and the threat of it replacing humans, why haven't, unless they haven't, I've never heard of it, people have the same response to animation? It's exactly the same thing. You've got a completely synthetic being that people relate to emotionally, effectively. It replaces, but there's never that, oh, it's going to replace people, or animations are evil, right? I just throw it out. What is it about robots that
they can't manipulate the world in the same way that
it's Skynet works?
Right. I'm talking about even in a performance context, but yeah, certainly.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Did you say context? Yeah.
Right.
I was going to
David, I think part of that, I've just had in my mind sort of this modernist paradigm that in some ways kind of emerges around the same time as the first kind of thinking about robotics. It's Chapek. It's thinking about thinking through Hegel's notion of recognition. I'm trying to think of all the times I've seen people interacting with robots. They're always right there in its face. They want to be recognized by that robot. They want that robot to acknowledge their presence in some way or another. And that feels very much to me like that master-slave dialectic, right? That particularly when we get into the 20th century, into kind of radical avant-garde readings of that master-slave dialectic. It's all about recognition. This is what Frantz Fanon focused on. So I think it's something about not being recognized by a robot that's coming. And part of the antagonism I've understood from what I've heard to these robots is, yes, it's an economic or class anxiety. But the other thing is that, what the fuck are you doing in our streets? You don't acknowledge we're here, except I'll just wait for you to get out of my way, right? And it feels in line with a broader sense of certain kinds of people
The Google buses.
not being recognized. Like you're not really here. And we're talking San Francisco, right? And probably among the cities where people are most conscious.
This would be rolling right down Market Street.
Yeah.
Which is
so you don't get
very
recognized in a city where you're not getting recognized, where so many people don't get recognized.
I wonder how people would respond to it if instead of this thing that's rolling down the street and not acknowledging you, it was actually this creature that was like walking in this forlorn and pathetic way because it was exhausted, and then when it sees people, it sort of moves very, solicitously out of the way, and if you start to attack it, whatever, and I suspect people will come to its defense. Others would probably completely, attack it and destroy it and bring out
the shape,
malice.
the size, and the whatever would shift things to some degree. In this case, they're not terribly robot-like in any sort of humanoid sense. They're just a rolling box, really.
Right.
But they do have defense mechanisms. So if you tamper with it, very loud piercing sirens go off. They have cameras all the way around so that they can see, if somebody needs to check in.
Well, that would make me want to attack it too.
I know. Have you seen the videos of the programmer slapping the robot? Of hitting it. Have you seen?
It's
seen
Boston
that?
Dynamics.
Yes, and they're slapping this thing in the face over and over and over again, and it's that it's just once again reinforcing. It's like that's going to come back in 100 years, and it's going to.
Yeah,
that's called the revolution.
Every good piece of sci-fi out there, which is, sci-fi is at its essence, it turns into a morality tale.
Exactly.
Every good piece of sci-fi that talks about robots or artificial life or the singularity basically comes back to this is what happens when you try to play God. And that's essentially what Pygmalion is about as well.
Absolutely.
This is what happens when you try to play God. Your creature takes on a life of its own, and it comes back and bites you. And so I think that so to riff off of your idea of sort of Hegelian recognition, this might be the counter side of that coin, in that there's also a fear of being recognized.
Well, so maybe a complication of that. So I've got in my mind, in particular, Westworld.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's, in that sense, what you have, and it almost parallels this exactly, where you have, if you're familiar with the series, one of the core, two of the central characters are both women who are robots, both of whom are being manipulated in some way by a human being in the narrative, all of whom are being manipulated by this kind of chief coder who's almost literally God in the show. And so I only raise that is that the other aspect of this would be we begin to feel as we encounter robots that regardless of what dynamic there might be between the two, there's something bigger out there that is exerting agency, the program, whether whether we have free will or it's determined. So there's always three in the picture, right?
There's actually something kind of, it's spinning a little bit back to video games, but there's something a bit revelatory about what it means to be the puppeteer. In a robotic context or a video game context, I don't know how many of you have read the article out there about The Sims and how basically everyone who plays The Sims begins behaving like a sociopath eventually, and torturing their Sims to death and haunting them and torturing them with clowns and whatever. And it also reveals something kind of deeply rooted within human nature, that this is our desire. Once we have the ability to play God, Black and White is another video game example where when you have the chance to play God, we tend to choose the evil path, which is kind of interesting.
GTA, Grand Theft Auto. How many of you have run over people and beat people with baseball bats?
It also traces back. I mean, for me, I'm thinking of like the Frankenstein novel, right? Like this concept, so that it's the body as this thing, this apparatus that can be built, and so it is definitely this playing God, because that's going back to Paradise Lost. But it's this anxiety about free will, about control, and about responsibility to others, and to this kind of like weirdly like a return of the repressed kind of thing. I think might because that whole in 100 years the robot wars are coming, and
Can I ask a question though? Oh, so a couple years ago, my stepson and I had this conversation. He said the jobs of the future are going to be robot designer or robot technician, and that'll be all there is. Everybody else, we're going to have some kind of universal salary for the rest of the world, because there's going to be nothing for us to do. And I was imagining like Robbie the robot. I was like, oh, it's going to take a long time for humans to get used to those, things coming down Market Street, and like I don't think that's that close. And he just picked up his phone and he was like, Siri, where's the nearest Walmart? And Siri said, Sebastian, the nearest Walmart is 1.5. And then so my question is, where does a robot begin? Does it have to be a metal object that looks like a thing, even a non-humanoid thing? Because after he and I had that conversation, I saw robots all around me. I couldn't not see them everywhere I went. And so I think it's like we're just getting used to. It's like it's slowly seeping into our acceptance. And the closer it looks like to a human, the weirder it is. But it's all around us anyway.
Just a comment about that is that gets to another robot trope, which is different from the one that you're talking about. That goes back to RUR, the robots are going to turn against you, is the Wall-E trope, which comes from the where the robots and that we become completely dependent on them because of their benevolence.
And there's also the Big Hero 6 trope as well, where you have this ghost of the memory of someone else within that circuitry as well, that is lovable. And I mean, the fear of robots, I think we like to pretend that it's a natural thing, but it's still an accultured, thing that we've been building as well.
Also, with both Wall-E and Big Hero 6, they talk about something completely different about human nature, because they're both beautiful films that address the very human issue of loneliness.
Yes.
And a desire in some ways to be more human. I don't know, or so that there's sympathy in the fact that that robot can't be fully human. Sort of like going back to Boon Raku, which is the way I think about too.
Right.
Puppetry.
Yeah.
David, can you, so this really, I find this whole narrative very compelling, and particularly the sort of seeming split between the cute robot and the threatening robot. Because again, like Robot actually came, in that first play from Worker.
Right.
Right? And so it's actually, I think a lot of this anxiety is, like part of it's the economic anxiety of being replaced, but it's also the economic anxiety of the power differentials that, right, in which one recognizes that one's own social position is reliant on compelled and subservient labor.
Yep.
Right? And so like the robots have always been slaves, and so we replay colonial and slave and imperial narratives out on them, both in the trope of like the Big Hero 6, who is the lovable servant, right, who stands by us even under torture and despite the fact of being, right, I mean, and then the nefarious, right, version, which is going to come up against us. But I'm wondering, if we're thinking about robots in terms of power, and particularly in terms of performance and their sort of history in that, when you see students working with these and when you're incorporating this into a kind of shared project, how do you structure the conversations around the kind of conceptual and relational approach to the robot, right? Like, do you kind of let students kind of feel out the robot wherever they are? Like, how do you attend to gender pronouns with the robots? Is Zeebzob always male? Are there, are there certain kinds of dynamics, like we get in the commedia, the kind of love story,
right.
Do you talk, how do you work through some of the power narratives that are like, that replay in particular ways through robots?
Yeah, no, that's a really, really, really good point. And Zeebzob isn't always male at all. You might have noticed actually in the demo when I made that for this, Zeebzob had the lips that somebody had added for one of the students for a performance. That's a really, really good point. It plays out exactly the same way that any question I think of puppetry plays out, insofar as ultimately who's responsible for Zeebzob's performance and the choices that you're making. It's the puppeteer, it's the creator, and sort of owning that and taking responsibility for that. So it's exactly the same way you would with any other performance that you were creating, really. But it raises those issues because you're, yeah.
I think there's a complication here, because the question that was in my mind, Sarah, was, and it relates to something you said earlier, David, about the robot as having a kind of distributed agency. And so my question has been, where is the robot? Right. So yeah, we can be responsible for what we do with the puppet, but because puppets are programs, and when we look at sort of mass-marketed puppets, or we're looking at something like Siri, for example, as robot, there are mechanics and procedures that aren't necessarily evident to us, and that we may have a robot in front of us that we're responsible for, that we're controlling and playing with and allowing to grow and develop in some ways, but that programming is also somewhere else that we can't really be responsible for.
Right.
And that can be for a number of reasons. Like, you know, the image that comes to my mind is Joy in Blade Runner 2049, where Joy is this beautiful individual for Kay, and she gets killed and he's in mourning, and then shortly after he's walking down the street and runs into giant ballerina Joy.
Right, right.
So that idea of responsibility is really important, but responsibility implies the capacity for mutual recognition, one, and also the ability to really locate where that responsibility is.
Right.
And with the robot, it's, and I think part of your talk showed that, it's not really all there, and it may be completely somewhere else.
Right.
I hope that makes sense.
It makes total sense.
And Sarah, I hope you understand how I think this question is a really interesting one, but it has very much to do with where do we locate agency and responsibility and the ethical moment.
Yeah, but I'm wondering, just if to follow up with Sarah, so how are these issues for you different when you're dealing with students programming a robot as opposed to students directing actors in a acting class with other actors? Because they're the same choices, they're the same issues that come up, they're the same presumptions. If anything, they can be even stronger because you've got gendered actors that people make assumptions about. So you're then imposing on these bodies, these actual bodies, these assumptions rather than this piece of metal that you can transform more easily.
Well, I mean, it seems to me that there is a real parallel there. I think the biggest difference is that, you know, obviously when you're working with actors or when you're working with student directors working with student actors, for example, like the student actors can say what they think, and part of the exercise, for me at least, in training student theater makers, really in like the art of collaboration, is how to listen properly.
Right, and how to give a space for people to say what they think.
Right, right, and how to listen to things that are going unsaid, and how to, you know, yeah. I mean, I think making space is a great kind of overarching metaphor for what that process is. The robot only says what the robot's been taught how to say. And what the robot has been taught how to say is a direct reflection of who has been interacting with the robot.
Right.
So in many ways, and part of what this whole discussion and what Mike is talking about, right, it's like robots are essentially these kinds of mirrors that take what are our fears and fantasies and ideas and projections and kind of play them back to us in a way that, depending on how it's calibrated, may be incredibly reassuring of our social choices and our position in society, might be incredibly threatening based on what kinds of choices that, right? So I guess my question is that when you're working with students, because robots have this potential to be a seemingly objective and neutral space, that then people, I think the temptation is always to read those reflections as natural.
Right.
And this is coming up in a slightly different kind of emphasis on bot environment, right, which is where we talk about algorithms, right, that are not written as neutral entities, right, that are making certain kinds of assumptions about the world and are reflecting certain kinds of patterns back to us, but appear to be objective and accurate and like what the world is, right, and then in fact are reshaping our perception. Right? There's this kind of feedback loop, which I think theater is particularly well suited to assess and to freeze in space in order to look at it better. But I guess my question, and I don't work with robots in performance. I haven't in a long time, and it was never sort of my major. But it brings to mind, like, it seems that there are interesting questions, but also some real problems or potential problems in helping students think through what are the implications. Like, you know, how do you interact with Zebzob, and what are the assumptions that you make? Then what are the assumptions that I make? Yeah. Then when you talk to it as a him, what do I understand about my relationship to this object? And if we construct certain kinds of, you know, romantic narratives, right, presumably heterosexual romantic narratives around, you know, an 18-inch piece of, you know, machinery, how does that affect how we understand our place in this and what our and what our position? You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah,
and so
absolutely.
and so I was just, you know, I mean, I don't mean to put you on the spot. Like, you are obviously an incredibly thoughtful, and I know you work through this stuff in really, you know, careful ways with your students. So that's what I was sort of getting
I mean,
at.
one thing that you're talking is making me think about in a really interesting way is the sex doll issue we were talking about before. Because, you know, if you're working with live performers, unfortunately, within a common conception of the director, you don't engage as collaboratively. You might. It's too much like the My Fair Lady Pygmalion thing. But there is the agency. There is a collaboration. There is. It's, you know, the actor is working with you, talking back. You don't have that with the robot. So there is that danger of then you're imposing completely your own fetishes and your own. I mean, you know. So I think that's something definitely to be incredibly conscious about, and to, you know. I think what you need is that perspective. The other students in the room are utterly crucial to that.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this, and one of the things that I find interesting, to continue the student actor metaphor, and to be fair, this is very incomplete, but the idea that the students have already had 18 years of almost continuous programming already, right? And that the fallacy that there is a tabula rasa robot, right, doesn't exist, which comes back to what Kiri was talking about with the avatars, right, or the digital utopia of we're divorced from our identity on the internet, and I think she cites Nakamura in her book, and cybertypes and the fallacy of the digital being universal. Right, and totally blank, and so I'm just the sort of singularity thing becomes that point, that tipping point to me. But and I'm sure someone has discussed this far more eloquently than I know of. But this idea of, is there such a thing as an autonomous robot, in the same way that, you know, we've been programmed by experience before. I was thinking about this just the other day. So I have, you know, Siri in the car, and now I have a 3-year-old sitting in the back. So when he wants to hear a song, I actually have to, I make a point of saying, please play, and then playing this song, thank you, right? To think about that data
really
entry,
important,
right?
There was just a thing about people trying to teach their kids to be nicer to their assistants, that children are being rude to Alexa and these home data assistants, and so there is a whole need to like.
And all the default servant voices are female.
So we're over time. So if anybody who wants to leave should feel this is a fantastic discussion.
It couldn't be when we're talking about the robot as you know, this, as you put it, a hunk of metal, right? And it's like tabula rasa that we're going to, you know. I think there's something interesting about considering Sean Nye's work on the aesthetic category of cute and the powerless thing, because I think especially when you think of Zeeb, right? I mean, Zeeb is adorable. I love Zeeb Zob. I love Zeeb Zob. I just want to say that. But Zeeb is cute and powerless, and the projections we put on Zeeb, I think, are interesting because we hold the agency with Zeeb always, I think.
Right.
Even in the way that we approach it as students, I think.
Well, there's I'm sorry.
No, please, jump in.
There's actually and this comes from social science, so there's a matrix of dehumanization, right? So there are two axes. There's the axis of competence, and then there's the axis of warmth. And so things that are warm but incompetent, that's where we get things that are cute. Right? And so babies, infant animals, right? And then we get things that are, to which we do not have warmth but are incompetent. And those are like people who are homeless, right? Our feelings about, incompetence. And then there are people who are competent and warm, right? Favorite coworkers, right? Friends who help you out, and then there are people who are competent, but for whom we feel no warmth, right? So those would be like, people who are highly accomplished in their jobs, but recognized as jerks. Right? And so it's basically like our relation, it's like how we understand, right? So we dehumanize or, rate the competence, but then how we effectively relate to them. And there are social science measures and scales of how to assess our relative understanding and reactions to people, things, and it's particularly interesting in the case of robots, of where they land on that scale of competence versus warmth.
Right, because like the delivery bots are just boxes. There's nothing about them that inspires sort of a sense of connection. I mean, Zeeb has eyes that change and look at you and move, and there's more of a connection in the warmth that you're talking about. And the boxes are just boxes.
And the vulnerability too. I mean, you're saying by far my favorite moment in Commedia Robotica that I think established that connection is when he falls over, the slapstick moment, which of course came about accidentally, and then so it was a real theater moment too, as they say it happens, and it totally for me humanizes Zeeb, right? That way, but it's by showing his incompetence in trying to be human. He's revealing his robotness, and then he's trying to get up and falls again. So, but I think that is a big part of it. Whereas I think the thing about the drones is not just that they're not anthropomorphic, but they're so competent, and they start to, when you start talking about the alarms and all those, it just makes it infinitely less appealing. That it can take care of itself would make me then want to challenge that even more, which is, as opposed to being this vulnerable thing that's going down the street and trying to do it.
It's also about their relational position too, isn't it? Because I think it's not just the economic and class anxieties, it's this literal vision of a world that you don't matter in at all. Because the drones have been told to go somewhere else by someone else to take them food in a way that, it makes the streets somewhere you don't understand anymore. I mean, it's like what Mike was saying about where is the robot. It's not just that this thing is a robot, it's that something unseen is driving it and people know what that is and they can control it and you don't, and it's happening in the street.
I think that
Jason is wrong.
This might be a bit too revealing of me as a parent, but my 4-year-old talks with Alexa, and you can say, Alexa, can we talk? Or Alexa, let's have a discussion. And he's practicing his speaking skills, no question. There's something that's going on there. It's the most adorable thing you've ever seen before. But at least on his level, I think she's an equal, no question. And she's actually teaching him how to converse. And I don't.
That's what freaks me out.
But I'll watch for hours and watch that conversation's happening. I'm not interrupted at all. I'm like, oh my gosh, what is happening here?
Well, we can marry these a little bit. Like, I think this is fascinating that you're teaching your child to be polite to Alexa, right? As a method of teaching your child how to be polite to humanity, right? And someday when your child is ready to learn this, you could explain that Alexa is a conglomeration of other humans who created her, that she herself is not a she, an entity or whatever. She is a conglomeration of non-neutral humans. Like, this is what I said yesterday. In my opinion, technology is neutral, but humans are not. So, someone's going to use Facebook to start a wonderful revolution, someone's going to use it to kill people, etc., whatever. But it's an interesting, progression, because, your child's learning how to speak, and that's great, but to let them understand at some point that Alexa is not a singular entity, but there's a whole collection of of real flesh and blood people, at least at this point. That might change in the future. It's like a kind of continuum, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so I think this is probably a good point. All right, so we're back tomorrow morning. Is it here? I think it's here again.